In the brutal winter of 1840, Apache Winters, a hardened fur trapper living in isolation near the remote Alaskan village of Whiteridge, discovers something that will shatter everything the villagers believe about the wilderness. When a massive, injured creature appears at his cabin door during the worst blizzard in decades, carrying two small, dying cubs, Apache faces an impossible choice that will either doom his soul or reveal the most profound truth about humanity itself. What unfolds in his tiny cabin over the next 7 days will expose a secret so devastating that it forces an entire village to confront the monsters they've become and the angels they've rejected. The scream that tore through the Alaskan wilderness on that December night in 1840 wasn't human, but it carried more pain than any man Apache Winters had ever heard die. He jolted upright in his rough-hewn bunk, rifle already in his weathered hands before his mind fully awakened, because in 23 years of hunting these frozen lands, Apache had learned that sounds like that meant something unnatural was suffering, and suffering things were dangerous things. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight, turning his small trapping cabin into a wooden island surrounded by an ocean of white death. Apache pressed his ear against the thick log wall, listening past the howling wind, past the rattling of loose boards, searching for that sound again. Nothing but nature's fury answered him back. But something deep in his chest, something that had kept him alive through Blackfoot raids and grisly attacks, whispered that whatever had made that cry was still out there, and it was coming closer. Apache was not a man who spooked easily. At 35, he had the kind of lean, scarred build that came from surviving what killed other men. His dark eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who read the wilderness like city folk read newspapers, and his Apache blood gave him instincts that had saved his life more times than he could count. The village of Whiteridge, 12 miles south through the treacherous mountain passes, considered him half savage anyway. They tolerated him because he brought them the finest furs in Alaska, but they crossed themselves when he walked past their church on his rare visits to town. Tonight, those survival instincts were screaming at him louder than the wind outside. Apache pulled on his heavy coat and boots, checking his rifle's load as he moved toward the cabin's single window. The glass was thick with frost, but he scraped away enough ice to peer into the swirling darkness. What he saw made his blood freeze in ways the Alaskan cold never could. A massive shadow moved through the snow, at least 8 feet tall, carrying something in its arms. It moved with the desperate, stumbling gait of something wounded, something that had traveled far beyond the limits of exhaustion. But this wasn't a bear or a moose or any creature Apache had hunted in his decades in the wilderness. This thing moved upright, with purpose, with intelligence, and as it drew closer to his cabin, Apache could see that what it carried were 2 smaller shadows, limp and lifeless looking. The creature stopped just outside his door, and for a moment that lasted forever, man and beast stared at each other through the frost-covered window. Apache found himself looking into eyes that held unmistakable intelligence, unmistakable desperation, and something else that made his hands shake on his rifle. Those eyes held hope. This thing, whatever it was, had sought him out deliberately. It had traveled through a killing blizzard to reach his cabin, and it was asking for help. Another scream tore from the creature's throat, but this time Apache heard it for what it truly was. Not a roar of aggression, but a parent's cry of anguish. The smaller forms in its massive arms weren't moving, and even through the howling wind, Apache could hear what sounded impossibly like sobbing. Every rational thought in Apache's mind told him to shoot first and examine the corpse later. Every survival instinct, honed by decades in the wilderness, screamed at him to protect himself from this unknown threat. But something deeper, something that connected to the Apache blood flowing in his veins, something that remembered when his own people had been the monsters in other men's stories, made him set down his rifle and reach for the door latch. The moment his hand touched the cold metal, the creature outside let out another cry, softer this time, almost pleading. Apache had heard that exact sound before, years ago, when he'd found a wounded doe trying to protect her dying fawn from wolves. It was the sound of a parent's love facing impossible odds, and it cut through every defense Apache had built around his heart. He opened the door, and the full fury of the blizzard hit him like a physical blow, but it was nothing compared to the shock of seeing the creature up close. It stood over 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur that was matted with ice and blood. Its face was a mixture of human and animal features that should have been terrifying, but the tears streaming down its cheeks made it heartbreakingly familiar. This was no monster. This was a mother, and she was dying. In her massive arms, she cradled 2 smaller versions of herself, cubs that couldn't have been more than a few months old. Their tiny chests barely moved with shallow breathing, and their fur was white with frost. Without the shelter of his cabin, all 3 of them would be dead within the hour. Apache stepped aside and gestured toward his cabin's interior. "Come," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Bring them inside." The creature looked at him with those impossibly expressive eyes, and Apache saw a flash of gratitude so profound it made his own eyes burn with unshed tears. She stumbled through his doorway, her massive frame barely fitting through the opening, and collapsed beside his fireplace, still clutching her cubs protectively against her chest. As Apache barred the door against the storm, he realized his life had just changed forever. In 12 miles south, the good Christian people of Whiteridge were probably praying for protection from the demons they imagined lurked in the wilderness. They had no idea he'd just invited one of those demons into his home, and that she was the most human thing he'd encountered in years. What Apache didn't know was that by dawn, he'd discover a truth so devastating about his beloved village that it would shatter every belief he'd ever held about good and evil, about monsters and men, and about the price of compassion in a world that had forgotten what the word meant. The creature's labored breathing filled his small cabin as Apache knelt beside her, and for the first time in his adult life, this hardened trapper found himself whispering a prayer to any god that might be listening. Because something told him that before this storm was over, he was going to need all the divine intervention he could get. What Apache discovered in the next hour would haunt him for the rest of his life, because the creature bleeding on his cabin floor wasn't just any mother desperately trying to save her young. She was trying to save the last of her kind, and the bullet wound in her shoulder told a story that made Apache's hands shake with rage he hadn't felt since the cavalry had burned his grandfather's village 20 years ago. The wound was fresh, maybe 6 hours old, and it had the distinctive pattern of a military rifle. Apache had seen enough bullet wounds to know this wasn't some accidental hunting shot. Someone had aimed for her heart and barely missed. Someone had tried to execute a mother carrying her babies, and that someone had enough skill with a rifle to suggest they weren't just some random trapper defending himself. As Apache cleaned the wound with whiskey and cloth torn from his own shirt, the creature watched him with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much understanding of what kindness meant. She didn't flinch when the alcohol burned her torn flesh. Instead, she made soft, rumbling sounds to her cubs, sounds that were unmistakably a mother's lullaby. One of the cubs stirred slightly at the sound, and Apache saw hope flicker across her massive features like candlelight in a church window. But it was what happened next that changed everything Apache thought he knew about the world. As he worked to bandage her shoulder, the creature reached out with one massive, gentle hand and touched his face. Her touch was warm despite the cold, and in that moment of contact, images flooded Apache's mind with the clarity of summer lightning. He saw through her eyes as she and her mate had lived peacefully in the deep mountain caves, raising their cubs far from human contact. He felt her joy as she watched her babies take their first steps, their first attempts at the complex language her people spoke in rumbles and gestures. He experienced her terror when the men with rifles had found their hidden valley, men who wore the cross of Christianity around their necks, while they murdered her mate without provocation. The visions came faster now, more intense. Apache saw her desperate flight through the wilderness. carrying her cubs as bullets whistled past her head. He felt her exhaustion as she traveled for days without rest, driven by nothing but a mother's love and the impossible hope that somewhere in this vast, hostile land, she might find one human being who still remembered what mercy meant. When the visions ended, Apache found tears streaming down his own face, and he understood why she had come to him. Somehow, across the vast wilderness, she had sensed something different about him. Maybe it was his Apache blood, maybe it was simply that he lived alone and apart from the hatred that seemed to poison men's hearts when they gathered in groups. Whatever it was, she had gambled her life and her cubs' lives on the hope that he might be different from the Christians who had murdered her family. Apache looked down at the cubs in her arms and felt his heart break completely. They were so small, so perfectly innocent, with tiny hands that looked almost human and eyes that held the same intelligence as their mothers. One was a female, slightly larger than her brother, and both had their mother's gentle expression despite their obvious suffering from cold and hunger. The mother creature made another soft sound, and Apache realized she was trying to speak to him. The sounds weren't random animal noises, but a complex language that carried meaning in its tones and rhythm. After several attempts, she managed something that sounded remarkably like "thank you" in broken English. And Apache understood that her people had been watching humans far longer than humans had suspected, learning their language, understanding their way. "You're welcome," Apache whispered back, and the relief that crossed her features was so profound it was almost human. Almost human. Apache caught himself in the thought and realized how backwards his thinking had become. This creature showed more humanity than most humans he'd known. She had risked everything to save her children, had traveled through killing cold and pain to find help, had trusted a stranger with the lives of everything she had left to love. Meanwhile, the good Christian people of Whiteridge had taught their children that creatures like her were demons to be destroyed on sight. Apache had heard the sermons himself on his rare visits to town. Pastor Williams preached that the wilderness was full of Satan's servants, that anything not made in God's image was evil by nature, that it was man's holy duty to cleanse the land of such abomination. As Apache built up the fire to warm his unexpected guests, a terrible realization began forming in his mind. The military rifle that had wounded her, the coordinated hunt that had killed her mate, the fact that she'd been driven toward his cabin rather than away from civilization. This hadn't been some chance encounter or accidental conflict. Someone had been hunting her people deliberately, and Apache had a sick feeling he knew who. The creature seemed to sense his growing understanding because she made another attempt at communication, pointing toward the south, where Whiteridge lay hidden in the mountains. Her expression was a mixture of fear and desperate pleading, and Apache realized she was trying to warn him about something. But warn him about what? His answer came in the form of distant rifle shots, echoing through the storm, still far away, but definitely approaching his valley. The creature heard them too, and the terror that crossed her face told Apache everything he needed to know. Whoever had shot her wasn't content to let her die quietly in the wilderness. They were tracking her, even through the blizzard, and they were getting close. Apache checked his ammunition supply and found he had maybe 20 rounds for his rifle and another dozen for his pistol. Against 1 or 2 hunters, that might be enough. Against the kind of organized hunting party that could track a wounded creature through a blizzard, it was suicide. But as he looked down at the mother creature clutching her dying cubs, Apache realized he'd already made his choice the moment he'd opened his door. The creature reached out and touched his hand again, and this time the vision was different. He saw her people's history, generations of peaceful giants who had lived in harmony with the land, who had watched over the wilderness like gentle guardians. He saw how they had helped lost travelers, how they had saved human children from wolves and bears, how they had asked nothing in return but to be left alone. And he saw what the humans had given them in exchange for their kindness. Fear, hatred, and bullets. Always bullets. The rifle shots were getting closer now, and Apache could hear voices carried on the wind. At least 6 men, maybe more, and they were moving with the efficiency of experienced hunters. In a few hours they would reach his cabin, and when they did, Apache would have to choose between everything he'd ever known and everything he'd just learned about what it truly meant to be human. As he loaded his rifle and prepared to make his stand, Apache wondered if the creature could sense his fear the way she'd shared her memories with him. Because right now, looking into her grateful, trusting eyes, Apache was more terrified than he'd ever been in his life. Not of dying, but of what he might have to become to keep this family alive. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and neither did the approaching voices of men who called themselves Christians while they hunted angels in the snow. The voices Apache heard approaching through the storm weren't the rough calls of desperate trappers lost in the wilderness. They were the organized communications of men who had done this before, men who moved through the killing cold with military precision and spoke in the measured tones of those who believed God was on their side. What made Apache's blood run colder than the Alaskan wind was that he recognized every single voice. Pastor Williams led them, his booming sermon voice now reduced to harsh whispers that carried clearly on the frozen air. Mayor Thompson was there too, along with blacksmith Morrison, storekeeper Hayes, and at least 3 others Apache couldn't immediately identify. These weren't strangers who had stumbled upon the creature's trail. These were the pillars of Whiteridge society, the men who shook his hand when he brought furs to trade, who nodded respectfully when he passed them on the street, who had never once suggested they spent their spare time hunting intelligent beings through blizzards. Apache positioned himself at the window, where he could watch their approach while keeping his rifle trained on the door. Behind him, the creature had arranged herself protectively around her cubs, her massive body forming a living shield between them and whatever was coming. She understood the danger better than Apache initially realized, because as the voices grew closer, he saw recognition in her eyes. She knew these men, had encountered them before, and the terror on her face told him everything about how those encounters had ended. The hunting party stopped just beyond rifle range, and Apache heard Pastor Williams call out in his familiar, authoritative voice, "Apache Winters, we know you're in there, and we know what you've got with you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Send the creature out, and we'll pretend this never happened." Apache felt his jaw clench as the true scope of what he was facing became clear. This wasn't some spontaneous hunt triggered by the creature's appearance. These men had been tracking her for days, maybe weeks, and they knew exactly where she would run when wounded. They had used Apache's cabin as a trap, counting on his isolation to corner their prey where she couldn't escape. "I don't know what you're talking about, Pastor," Apache called back, playing for time while his mind raced through his limited options. "Just me and my fire in here, riding out the storm." Mayor Thompson's voice joined the conversation, and Apache heard the cold calculation that had made the man successful in politics. "Apache, we saw the tracks leading to your door. We know what's in there, and we know you're decent enough not to harbor something that dangerous. These creatures have been killing our people for months. Send it out so we can end this." The lie hit Apache like a physical blow, because he could hear the practiced smoothness in Thompson's voice, the same tone the mayor used when he wanted the town council to approve his business venture. These men weren't responding to some recent threat. They were executing a plan they'd been working on for a long time, and Apache had just become an obstacle they needed to remove. Behind him, the creature made a soft sound that was unmistakably a whimper of pain, and Apache turned to see one of her cubs had stopped breathing. The tiny chest that had been rising and falling in shallow, desperate gasps was now perfectly still. The mother creature gathered the lifeless cub against her chest and began to keen, a sound so heartbreaking that Apache felt tears burning his eyes even as rays built in his chest like a forge fire. He looked back toward the window and saw Pastor Williams step closer, his rifle held with the casual confidence of a man who had used it many times before. The pastor's face, illuminated by the lantern light, showed none of the compassion Apache had seen during Sunday sermons. This was a different man entirely, one who looked at the world through the cold eyes of someone who had decided that some lives simply didn't matter. "Apache, "I'm going to explain something to you," Pastor Williams called out, his voice taking on the lecturing tone. Apache remembered from childhood Sunday school. Those things aren't animals, they're abominations, mockeries of God's creation that have no right to exist in his world. We've been blessed with the strength and wisdom to cleanse this land, and we won't let one confused trapper stand in the way of the Lord's work. The casual way Williams spoke about murder, the complete absence of doubt or moral struggle in his voice, made Apache understand that he wasn't dealing with men who had been driven to extremes by fear or desperation. These were men who had convinced themselves that genocide was a holy calling, and they slept peacefully at night because they believed God approved of their work. Apache heard movement outside and realized the hunting party was spreading out to surround his cabin. Through gaps in the storm, he caught glimpses of rifle barrels and lantern light positioning themselves at strategic points. These men had done this before, had refined their tactics through practice, and Apache was beginning to understand that the creature bleeding on his floor might be the last survivor of something far more terrible than a simple hunt. The remaining cub stirred in its mother's arms and let out a weak cry that was heartbreakingly similar to a human baby's distress call. The sound seemed to galvanize something in the creature, and she looked up at Apache with eyes that held a desperate plea. She pointed toward the back of his cabin, toward the small root cellar he used for food storage, and Apache understood she was asking him to hide her surviving child. Without hesitation, Apache moved to help her, but as he approached, she grabbed his arm with surprising gentleness and pressed something into his hand. It was a carved stone, no bigger than his palm, covered with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and move in the firelight. The moment it touched his skin, Apache felt a rush of knowledge that nearly buckled his knees. He saw the truth about Whiteridge, about the good Christian people he'd traded with for years. He saw Mayor Thompson's ledgers, pages documenting bounties paid for creature scalps, and carved stones like the one now burning in Apache's palm. He saw Pastor Williams blessing hunting expeditions with prayers that asked God to guide their bullets true. He saw the town council meetings where they had planned the systematic extinction of an entire species, meetings where they had justified their actions with carefully selected Bible verses about man's dominion over beasts. But worst of all, he saw what they had done with the body. The creature's people hadn't just been hunted for sport or killed out of fear. They had been harvested, their unique physiology studied, and exploited by men who saw profit in every drop of their blood. The creature's healing abilities, their resistance to cold, their incredible strength, all of it had been catalogued and experimented with in a basement laboratory beneath the church that Apache had walked over dozens of times without knowing what lay beneath his feet. The visions showed him rooms full of specimenazes, notebooks filled with anatomical drawings, and worst of all, the cages where some of the creatures had been kept alive for extended study. Apache saw torture disguised as research, saw suffering that had been carefully prolonged and documented, saw the faces of creatures who had died in agony, while Pastor Williams took notes and quoted scripture about the necessity of understanding God's enemies. When the visions ended, Apache found himself on his knees beside the creature, his whole body shaking with revulsion and rage. The stone in his hand had grown warm, and somehow he knew it contained the recorded memories of her entire people, passed down through generations and now entrusted to him as the last witness to their existence. Outside, Pastor Williams was growing impatient. "Apache, we're not going to wait much longer. Send out the creature, or we'll come in and get it ourselves. Don't force us to hurt you over something that isn't even human." Apache looked down at the mother creature, who was now cradling her one surviving cub, while tears streamed down her face. She had lost her mate, her home, most of her people, and now one of her children. Everything she had ever loved was gone except for the tiny, struggling life in her arms, and even that was fading fast despite her desperate attempts to keep it warm. The creature looked up at Apache and spoke again, this time managing several words in clear English that she must have learned from years of secretly watching humans. "Please," she whispered, her voice surprisingly gentle despite her massive size. "Save My baby. Those 3 words shattered every remaining doubt in Apache's mind. He looked toward the door where 6 armed men waited to complete their genocide, then back at the dying mother who had trusted him with the last hope of her species. When he spoke, his voice was steady and cold as winter steel. "Pastor Williams," Apache called out, "I think you'd better come in here and see something, but come alone, and leave your rifle outside. What I've got to show you is going to change everything." Pastor Williams entered Apache's cabin with the confident stride of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness. But what he saw by the firelight stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't the massive creature cradling her dying cub that shattered his composure, though that sight would have terrified most men. It was the carved stone glowing in Apache's outstretched hand, pulsing with an inner light that Williams recognized with the horror of someone seeing their deepest secrets exposed. "Where did you get that?" Williams whispered, his voice losing all its authoritative power as he stared at the stone. His face had gone pale beneath his frost-burned cheeks, and his hands trembled as he unconsciously reached toward the similar stone hanging from a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his heavy coat. Apache saw the telltale movement and felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. "You have one too, don't you, Pastor? How long have you been carrying the memories of the people you've murdered? How long have you been living with their voices in your head?" William's composure cracked completely, and for the first time since Apache had known him, the pastor looked every one of his 63 years. He sank into Apache's only chair as if his legs could no longer support him, his rifle forgotten against the doorframe. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of sleepless nights and carefully buried guilt. "You don't understand what we're dealing with, Apache. These creatures, they're not what they seem. They get into your mind, make you feel things, make you doubt everything you know to be true." Williams pulled the stone from beneath his coat, and Apache saw it was identical to the one the creature had given him. Except where hers pulsed with warm light, the pastor's seemed to absorb light, creating a small void of darkness against his chest. The creature made a sound of recognition when she saw Williams's stone, and the fear in her eyes intensified. Through the connection Apache still felt with her memories, he understood why. That stone didn't contain the peaceful history of her people. It held their screams, their terror, their final moments, as they died under Pastor Williams' knife. It was a trophy, a record of suffering that the pastor had been carrying like a badge of honor. 23 years, Williams continued, his voice hollow and distant. 23 years since I killed my first one, and every night since then, I've heard its voice asking me why. Do you know what it's like to carry the dying thoughts of something that loved as deeply as any human? To feel its confusion as you explain that God demands its death? Apache felt his stomach turn as the true scope of William's madness became clear. The pastor hadn't been driven to hunt these creatures by fear or hatred. He had been addicted to their deaths, feeding on their final emotions like some kind of spiritual vampire. Each stone around his neck was another fix, another dose of the profound grief and terror that had become his drug of choice. "But you kept killing them," Apache said, his voice thick with disgust. "Even knowing what they were, what they felt, you kept hunting them." Williams looked up with eyes that held the kind of desperate justification Apache had seen in men who had crossed lines they could never uncross. "Because they made me feel things I had no right to feel. Do you understand? I was supposed to be a man of God, devoted to his service, but when I touched that first stone, I felt love so pure it made everything I'd ever called holy seem like a mockery. Their capacity for emotion, for connection, for genuine spiritual experience, it was everything I'd pretended to have in 20 years of ministry." The creature stirred at William's words. Apache realized she understood every word. Her people had been watching humans far longer than anyone had suspected, learning not just their language but their psychology, their motivations, their capacity for both creation and destruction. She had known from the moment Williams walked through the door that he was the architect of her people's extinction. Williams continued his confession, the words pouring out like poison from an infected wound. Mayor Thompson thought it was about land development, about clearing the wilderness for expansion. Morrison thought it was about protecting the town from dangerous animals. But I knew the truth from the first moment I touched one of their memory stones. We weren't killing monsters, Apache. We were killing everything we should have been and never had the courage to become. Apache looked down at the stone in his own hand, feeling the weight of an entire civilization's memories pressing against his consciousness. Through the creature's shared experiences, he could see what Williams meant. Her people didn't just live in harmony with nature, they were harmony itself, existing in a state of spiritual connection that humans could barely comprehend. They felt each other's joys and sorrows, shared memories and experiences across generations, lived and died as part of something larger than themselves. So, you decided to wipe them out, Apache said, because they made you feel inadequate, because they made me feel human, Williams shouted, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. Do you think I wanted to discover that everything I dedicated my life to was a lie? That real spirituality, real connection to the divine, was walking around in these forests, while I stood in a pulpit every Sunday pretending to understand God's love. The creature made another soft sound, and Apache realized she was trying to communicate with Williams directly. She gestured toward her dying cub, then toward Williams, and Apache understood she was offering him the same gift she had given Apache. The chance to truly understand what he had been destroying. Williams recoiled, as if she had offered him a poisonous snake. No, I won't let you into my head again. I won't let you show me what love is supposed to look like. But even as he spoke, Apache could see the hunger in the pastor's eyes, the desperate craving for the very connection he claimed to reject. Outside, Mayor Thompson's voice cut through the storm. Williams, what's taking so long in there? We need to finish this before the weather clears. The sound of Thompson's voice seemed to snap Williams back to his mission, and Apache watched the man's face transform as he rebuilt his walls of righteous certainty. You're right, Thompson, Williams called back. Just confirming what we're dealing with. He turned back to Apache with renewed determination. This ends tonight, Apache. I won't let you fall under their spell the way I did. But as Williams reached for his rifle, the creature did something that changed everything. She extended one massive, gentle hand toward the pastor, and in her palm lay another carved stone, this one glowing with the pure, warm light of unconditional love. Through his connection with her, Apache understood what she was offering. Not her memories of pain and loss, but her memories of joy, of the pure happiness she had felt, raising her cubs, of the simple pleasure of existing in perfect harmony with the world around her. Williams stared at the offered stone with naked longing, and Apache saw tears streaming down the pastor's weathered face. For just a moment, the masks fell away completely, and Apache saw the broken man beneath all the religious rhetoric. Someone who had spent his entire life searching for the divine connection he preached about, only to discover it in the very beings he had convinced himself were demons. The creature spoke again, her English clearer now despite her weakening condition. I forgive you, she said simply. My people forgive you. We know you are lost, not evil. We know you kill us because our love reminds you of love you never learned to give. Those words hit Williams like a physical blow. He dropped his rifle and fell to his knees beside the creature, his whole body shaking with suppressed sobs. I can't, he whispered, I can't take your forgiveness. Do you know how many of your people I've killed? Do you know what I've done to them? The creature's response was to gently touch the pastor's face with her free hand, and Apache watched as decades of carefully maintained hatred crumbled in an instant. Williams gasped, as if he'd been drowning and suddenly found air, and when he looked up, his eyes held a clarity Apache had never seen before. But that moment of redemption was shattered by the sound of the cabin door exploding inward, as Mayor Thompson and his men lost patience with waiting. They burst through in a cloud of snow and gunpowder smoke, rifles raised and ready to fire, But what they found wasn't what they had expected. Instead of Apache holding a dangerous creature at gunpoint, they found their spiritual leader kneeling beside the dying mother, weeping openly as he cradled her remaining cub in his arms. The tableau was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything they thought they knew about Pastor Williams, that for a moment none of them could speak. Thompson recovered first, his political instincts telling him that everything he had carefully planned was falling apart. "William, get away from that thing before it infects you with whatever madness it's already put in Apache's head." But Pastor Williams stood slowly, still holding the creature's cub, and when he turned to face his fellow hunters, Apache saw that the man who had led genocidal hunts for 23 years was gone forever. In his place stood someone who had finally remembered what it meant to serve something greater than his own fears. "Thomas," Williams said quietly, using Thompson's first name in a way that suggested their power dynamic had just shifted permanently. "We need to talk." What Mayor Thompson revealed in the next 10 minutes would expose a conspiracy so twisted that it made the creature's genocide seem like only the beginning of something far more sinister. Because while Pastor Williams had been collecting memory stones out of spiritual addiction, Thompson had been harvesting the creature's unique biology for experiments that would have made the devil himself recoil in horror. "Williams, step away from that abomination right now," Thompson commanded, his rifle trained not on the creature but on his longtime collaborator. "I don't know what spell it's cast on you, but I won't let 23 years of good work be destroyed by one moment of weakness." Apache saw something in Thompson's eyes that made his blood freeze, a cold calculation that went far beyond religious fanaticism or even simple hatred. This was the look of a man who viewed living beings as nothing more than resources to be exploited. And Apache realized that whatever had been driving the systematic hunting of the creatures went much deeper than spiritual delusion. Pastor Williams straightened to his full height, still cradling the creature's cub against his chest. "Thomas, what we've been doing is wrong. These beings aren't demons or animals, they're people, and we've been murdering them for decades." Thompson's laugh was harsh and bitter. "People, Williams, you've completely lost your mind. These things are the most valuable biological specimens on Earth, and you want to treat them like Sunday school children?" He gestured to the other hunters, who had spread out to cover all angles of the small cabin. "Morrison, Hayes, prepare the containment equipment. We're taking all 3 of them alive." Apache felt his heart skip a beat as the true scope of Thompson's plans became clear. The mayor wasn't here to kill the creature and her cub. He was here to capture them, to add them to whatever collection he had been building over the decades. Through the connection he still maintained with the creature's memories, Apache suddenly understood why she had been so terrified when she recognized the voices outside. Some of her people hadn't died quickly in the wilderness. Some had been taken alive. Containment equipment. Williams demanded, his voice rising with horrified realization. "Thomas, what containment equipment? What have you been doing with the body?" Thompson's smile was the coldest thing Apache had ever seen. "Bodies? Oh, Williams, you naive fool. Do you think I've been paying bounties for corpses all these years? Dead specimens are useful for anatomy, but living ones are where the real value lies." He pulled a small vial from his coat pocket, and Apache could see it contained a glowing liquid that pulsed with the same rhythm as the creature's heartbeat. "Do you know what this is, Pastor? This is concentrated essence extracted from a living specimen. 1 drop can heal wounds that would normally take weeks to recover from. A full dose can add years to a human lifespan." Apache watched William's face go white as the pastor began to understand the true horror of what he had been enabling. "The church basement," Williams whispered. "Those rooms I thought were for storage. You've been keeping them alive down there. 17 of them to be precise," Thompson said with obvious pride. "The last breeding population of their species, carefully maintained in optimal conditions for maximum essence production." "Your hunts haven't been about extermination, Williams. They've been about capturing breeding stock for the most profitable operation in Alaska." The creature let out a cry of anguish that was so profoundly human in its pain that even the hardened hunters shifted uncomfortably. Through their connection, Apache felt her despair as she realized that her people hadn't simply died. They had been enslaved, tortured, and slowly drained of their life force to feed human greed. Her mate, her friends, her extended family, all of them were still alive somewhere beneath Whiteridge, suffering in ways that made quick death seem like mercy. "You're insane," William said, his voice shaking with rage. "You're talking about torture, about keeping intelligent beings as livestock for some kind of perverted medical experiment." Thompson shrugged as if they were discussing crop rotation. "I'm talking about progress, Williams. Do you think the men who fund my operation care about the feelings of some wilderness monsters?" Senator Bradley's arthritis disappeared completely after 6 months of treatments. Governor Morrison hasn't aged a day in 5 years. The Secretary of the Interior personally oversees our shipments to Washington. Apache felt the world spinning around him as the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just a local operation driven by one man's greed. The systematic extermination and enslavement of an entire species was being orchestrated at the highest levels of government, with the creature's essence being distributed to the most powerful men in America. The territorial expansion, Apache said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. All those new mining claims, the railroad surveys, the military outposts. You're not just trying to develop Alaska. You're trying to capture every remaining member of their species. Thompson nodded approvingly. "Very good, Apache. I always knew there was more to you than just hunting skills. Yes, we've been systematically mapping and clearing their territories for the past decade. Every new settlement, every logging operation, every mining claim has been carefully positioned to drive them toward capture zones." He gestured toward the creature. "This one was actually quite clever, avoiding our nets for almost 2 years, but maternal instinct makes even the smartest creatures predictable." The casual way Thompson discussed genocide as a business strategy made Apache want to vomit, but it was what the mayor said next that truly horrified him. "Of course, we've always known we'd eventually need fresh genetic material to keep the breeding program viable. That's where you come in, Apache." "What are you talking about?" Apache demanded, though something cold in his stomach suggested he already knew. Thompson's smile widened. "Your Apache blood, of course. Our scientists have discovered that certain bloodlines have a natural compatibility with the creature's essence. Native Americans, particularly those from specific tribal backgrounds, can absorb their abilities without the usual side effect. We've been waiting for the right opportunity to recruit you." Apache felt the world tilt as he realized he had never been an outsider to this conspiracy. He had been a target, marked for recruitment or elimination based on his genetic heritage. Every friendly interaction with the people of Whiteridge, every seemingly casual question about his background, had been part of a larger plan to determine his usefulness to their operation. "You want to turn me into one of your test subjects?" Apache said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "Test subject? Oh no, Apache, we want to make you a partner." Thompson pulled out another vial, this one filled with a different substance that seemed to move with its own life. "This is a refined version of the essence, designed specifically for individuals with your genetic markers. One injection, and you'll have their strength, their healing abilities, their resistance to cold and disease. You'll be the first of a new breed of enhanced humans." The creature made another sound, this one carrying a warning that Apache felt in his bones. Through their connection, he understood that what Thompson was offering wasn't enhancement, but corruption. The essence, when taken by force rather than freely given, didn't grant abilities. It created addiction, madness, and eventually a hunger that could only be satisfied by taking more essence from living creatures. "That's what happened to you, isn't it?" Apache asked, looking at Thompson with new understanding. "You've been using their essence yourself. That's why you look 20 years younger than you should, why you never get sick, why you can track through blizzards like some kind of supernatural hunter." Thompson's expression darkened. "I've been perfecting the process, yes, testing the limits of what their essence can do for the right kind of person. But the supply has been limited, which is why we need a larger breeding population and willing human subjects to help us expand operations. Apache looked around the cabin at the men he had known for years, seeing them clearly for the first time. Morrison stood with the dead-eyed expression of someone who had long ago stopped questioning orders. Hayes fidgeted with equipment that looked more like torture devices than hunting gear. Even Williams, despite his recent revelation, had the hollow look of someone who had been slowly poisoned by years of proximity to evil. But it was the creature's response that truly broke Apache's heart. Instead of showing fear or anger at Thompson's revelations, she looked at Apache with profound sadness and whispered, in her clearest English yet, "Your people suffer too. We know. We have seen." Through their connection, Apache felt her sharing memories of other Native Americans who had been recruited into Thompson's operation, men and women who had been promised power and partnership but had ended up as test subjects themselves. He saw the basement laboratories from the creature's perspective, saw the cages that held not just her people, but humans who had been modified and experimented on until they were no longer recognizable as either species. "The missing trappers," Apache said, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Johnny Crow Feather, Sam Two Eagles, Maria Whitehorse. They didn't disappear in the wilderness. You took them. Thompson nodded without shame. Preliminary test subjects. Unfortunately, the process wasn't fully refined yet, and they experienced some unexpected side effects. But their sacrifice has helped us perfect the techniques we want to use on you. Apache felt rage building in his chest like a wildfire, but before he could act on it, the creature reached out and touched his hand again. This time the vision she shared wasn't of the past, but of the present. He saw the basement beneath the church, saw 17 magnificent beings chained and caged like animals, saw the torture devices Thompson's people used to extract their essence, saw the human test subjects in various stages of transformation and madness. But most importantly, he saw hope, because among the imprisoned creatures was an ancient female, older and larger than the others, who had been using her connection to her people to coordinate something. The survivors weren't just enduring their captivity. They were planning escape, and they had been waiting for exactly this moment, when one of their people would find a human ally strong enough to help them break free. The creature squeezed Apache's hand and whispered, "Tonight, storm covers sound. They wait for signal." She looked up at him with eyes that held desperate hope. "You help them. You help us go home." Apache looked around the cabin at Thompson's hunters, at the weapons and equipment they had brought to capture him, and the creature, at the madness in the mayor's eyes as he prepared to inject Apache with stolen essence. Then he looked down at the dying cub in William's arms, at the mother who had lost everything but still found the strength to offer hope to others of her kind. When Apache spoke, his voice was steady and calm, though inside he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Thompson, I think you've made one critical mistake in all your planning." "Oh? And what's that?" Apache's smile was cold as winter death. "You forgot that I'm not just part Apache. I'm also part Winters, and the Winters family has never taken kindly to slavers." What happened in the next 30 seconds would later be remembered by the survivors as the moment when the natural order of the world reasserted itself with a violence that shook the very foundations of Whiteridge. Because when Apache Winters decided to choose sides in a war between humanity and compassion, he brought with him 23 years of wilderness survival skills and a rage that had been building since the first moment he understood what Thompson's people had done to an entire species. Apache's move was so sudden that Thompson's hunters never had a chance to react. He dove behind his overturned table just as the creature let out a call that wasn't quite a roar and wasn't quite a song, but carried through the storm with a resonance that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. Through the windows, Apache heard an answering call from the direction of Whiteridge, then another, then a chorus of voices that had been silent for too long. "Impossible," Thompson breathed, his face going white as he realized what that sound meant. "They can't be coordinated. The dampening fields, the isolation chambers, the psychic suppressors. They shouldn't be able to communicate. But Pastor Williams, still clutching the creature's cub, laughed with the bitter joy of a man watching his own sins come back to haunt his oppressors. "Thomas, you fool. You've been so busy studying their bodies that you never understood their souls. Love doesn't need technology to reach through walls." The creature's call had been a signal, and within minutes Apache could hear the sounds of destruction carrying on the wind from the direction of town. 17 beings who had been tortured and enslaved for decades were finally free, and their liberation was proceeding with the methodical efficiency of a plan that had been carefully prepared and patiently executed. Morrison was the first of Thompson's men to break. The sound of his friends and neighbors screaming in the distance, combined with the inhuman intelligence in the creature's eyes, shattered his nerve completely. "This is wrong, Mayor. These things are talking to each other across 12 miles of wilderness. They're not animals. They're not even human. They're something else entirely, and we've been torturing them for sport." Thompson shot Morrison without hesitation, his essence-enhanced reflexes allowing him to draw and fire before the blacksmith could finish his sentence. "Anyone else want to develop a conscience at the worst possible moment?" Thompson asked, his voice carrying the cold madness of someone who had long ago lost any connection to normal human emotion. Apache used the moment of shocked silence that followed to grab his rifle and put 2 rounds into Hayes before the storekeeper could bring his weapon to bear. But it was the creature who truly turned the tide of battle. Despite her wounds, despite her exhaustion, despite the fact that she was still cradling her dead cub, she moved with a speed and grace that reminded Apache why her people had survived in the wilderness for thousands of years. Her massive hand closed around Thompson's rifle barrel, and Apache heard the metal crumple like paper. Thompson tried to draw his sidearm, but the creature's other hand caught his wrist with surprising gentleness, holding him immobile without breaking his bone. When she spoke, her voice carried a sadness that made Apache's heart ache. "You made yourself into monster," she said, looking directly into Thompson's eyes. "We could have shared our gifts freely. We could have taught you harmony with world, healing without pain, strength without violence. But you chose to take by force what we would have given with love." Thompson's response was to pull a knife from his boot and drive it toward the creature's throat, but Apache was ready for him. The rifle shot echoed through the cabin like thunder, and Thompson dropped to the floor with a hole through his chest, his essence-enhanced blood pooling around him in patterns that seemed to glow with their own light. As Thompson died, his stolen vitality began to leave his body in visible streams of light that flowed back toward the creature. Apache watched in amazement as the mayor's artificially youthful appearance aged decades in seconds, revealing the withered husk of a man who had been consuming stolen life for years. By the time his heart stopped beating, Thompson looked like the ancient monster he had always been inside. Pastor Williams knelt beside the dying mayor, and Apache was surprised to see genuine grief on the pastor's face. "Thomas, what did we become? How did we lose our way so completely?" But Thompson's final words carried no repentance, no recognition of the evil he had committed. With his last breath, he whispered, "The specimens in Washington. They'll send more hunters. This isn't over." The creature heard Thompson's warning and looked at Apache with urgent concern. "More will come. My people, they cannot fight many humans with guns. We must go deep mountains, find places where your kind cannot follow." Apache felt his heart breaking as he realized what she was telling him. The liberation of her people wasn't the end of their struggle, but only the beginning. As long as there were humans who knew about their existence, who craved their essence and their abilities, her people would never be safe. They would have to abandon their ancestral territories and retreat so far into the wilderness that they might never find their way back to the homes their ancestors had known for millennia. Through the windows, Apache could see lights moving through the storm, and he realized the freed creatures were approaching his cabin. When they arrived, the sight of them took his breath away. They moved through the blizzard like living shadows, their massive forms barely visible except for their eyes, which glowed with an inner light that spoke of intelligence far older than human civilization. The ancient female Apache had seen in his visions was among them, and when she entered the cabin, her presence filled the small space with a dignity that made Apache want to kneel. She approached the injured mother and gently took the surviving cub, examining it with the skilled hands of someone who had delivered countless babies over the centuries. "This one will live," she said in English that was far more fluent than her daughter's. "But he will be the last born in the old lands. We must go where humans cannot follow, and we may never return." Apache looked around the cabin at the bodies of Thompson's hunters, at Pastor Williams weeping over his dead collaborator, at the creatures who had suffered decades of torture and slavery, and felt the weight of his own species' capacity for evil settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "There has to be another way," Apache said. "Somewhere you can live in peace, somewhere the government hunters can't find you." The ancient female fixed him with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. "Young human, your heart is good, but your people's hunger has no limits. They will not stop hunting us until we are all dead or enslaved. The only safety is in places so remote that even we may not survive them." But it was Pastor Williams who provided an unexpected solution. Still holding the creature's dead cub, he looked up with eyes that held a desperate hope. What if they didn't know you still existed? What if everyone who knew about you was dead or sworn to secrecy? Apache understood immediately what Williams was suggesting. The records, Thompson's files, the laboratory, the specimens he shipped to Washington, if all of that disappeared, if there was no evidence that your people ever existed, the government would have no reason to keep hunting. The ancient female considered this carefully. "You would destroy the proof of our existence, even the proof of what was done to us." Williams nodded, tears still streaming down his face. "I've spent 23 years documenting your people's suffering for my own twisted purposes. Let me spend whatever time I have left erasing every trace of that documentation. Let me give you back your anonymity." It was a solution that carried its own terrible price. The creature's story would never be told, their suffering would never be acknowledged, and the men responsible for their near extinction would be remembered as ordinary citizens who had died in a blizzard, rather than the monsters they had actually been. But as Apache looked at the surviving cub breathing peacefully in the ancient female's arms, he realized that justice mattered less than survival. The creature's continued existence was more important than any human need to record and remember their persecution. The ancient female seemed to read his thoughts. "You understand the choice, young hunter. Truth or safety, memory or survival. We cannot have both." Apache nodded, feeling older than his 35 years. "Then we choose survival. Your people have the right to exist in peace, even if it means the world never knows what was done to you." As dawn approached and the storm finally began to clear, Apache watched the creatures gather their dead and prepare for a journey that would take them far beyond the reach of human civilization. The mother he had saved touched his face one last time, sharing a final vision of gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. "You gave us tomorrow," she whispered. "That is greatest gift anyone can give." And then they were gone, vanishing into the wilderness like legends returning to the realm of myth, leaving behind only memories and the promise that somewhere in the deepest mountains, love had finally triumphed over greed. What Apache and Pastor Williams accomplished in the 3 days following the liberation would become the most thorough cover-up in Alaska's history, but it would cost them both everything they had ever believed about truth, justice, and the price of doing what was right. Because erasing the evidence of an entire species' existence meant destroying not just Thompson's records, but the souls of every person who had participated in their persecution. The basement beneath Whiteridge's church was a chamber of horrors that exceeded even Apache's worst expectations. 17 cells lined the walls, each one designed to hold a creature in positions that maximized their suffering while keeping them alive for essence extraction. The torture devices were works of engineering precision, crafted to cause maximum pain while ensuring the victims remained conscious and productive. But it was the human cells that truly broke Apache's heart. In the deepest part of the basement, he found the remains of Johnny Crow Feather, Sam Two Eagles, and Maria Whitehorse, along with 6 other Native Americans whose names he recognized from missing person reports over the past decade. They had been transformed into something that was neither human nor creature, their bodies twisted by forced injections of essence until they had become living experiments in Thompson's quest to create enhanced soldiers. "My God," Pastor Williams whispered, staring at the evidence of his complicity. "I blessed these experiments. I told Thompson that God would forgive any sin committed in service of a greater good. I stood in this room and quoted scripture, while innocent people screamed." Apache found Thompson's complete records in a fireproof safe, thousands of pages documenting every aspect of the creature's biology, behavior, and exploitation. The files included correspondence with government officials, reaching all the way to Washington, shipping manifests for essence deliveries, and detailed plans for expanding the operation across the entire Western territories. Among the papers, Apache discovered the truth about his own heritage. Thompson hadn't been guessing about Apache's genetic compatibility with the creature's essence. The government had been tracking specific bloodlines for decades, identifying Native Americans whose ancestry included contact with the creature's people generations ago. Apache's great-grandmother had been one of the creatures, captured and forced to breed with a human trapper in an early experiment that had produced his grandmother. "You're one of them," Williams said quietly, reading over Apache's shoulder. "That's why you could connect with her so easily, why you understood their language instinctively. You're the child of 2 worlds." Apache felt the weight of that revelation settling into his bones. Everything about his life suddenly made sense. His unusual strength, his ability to survive in conditions that killed other men, his instinctive understanding of the wilderness, and most importantly, his immediate empathy for the creature who had sought shelter in his cabin. But understanding his heritage also meant understanding what they were about to destroy. By erasing all evidence of the creature's existence, Apache would be erasing proof of his own origins, condemning himself to never fully know who he was or where he came from. They worked for 3 days straight, burning documents, destroying laboratory equipment, and collapsing the basement chambers so thoroughly that no one would ever suspect what had happened beneath the church. Williams proved to be surprisingly thorough in his destruction, attacking the evidence of his crimes with the same obsessive dedication he had once brought to committing them. On the 2nd day, they discovered Thompson's private laboratory, hidden behind a false wall in his mayoral office. The room contained the mayor's most prized specimens, essence samples from the ancient female, memory stones from dozens of murdered creatures, and detailed anatomical studies that revealed secrets about the creature's biology that could have revolutionized human medicine. This knowledge could save thousands of human lives, Williams said, holding a vial of concentrated healing essence. "Cancer, heart disease, aging itself. This could be the answer to humanity's greatest medical challenges." Apache looked at the vial, knowing that it represented liquid torture, years of suffering extracted from beings who had only wanted to live in peace. "At what cost, Pastor? How many innocent lives would we sacrifice to save human ones? How many creatures would we enslave to extend our lifespans?" Williams stared at the vial for a long moment, then hurled it against the wall, watching the glowing liquid splatter across Thompson's carefully documented research. "You're right. Some knowledge is too expensive to possess." They burned everything, every document, every specimen, every piece of equipment that could be used to recreate Thompson's work. Apache watched decades of scientific research go up in flames and felt simultaneously guilty and relieved. Humanity was losing knowledge that could have changed the world, but the creatures were gaining the anonymity that might allow them to survive. The hardest part was dealing with the human remains. Apache and Williams buried the transformed Native Americans in a hidden grove outside town, marking their graves only with traditional Apache symbols that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't share Apache's heritage. As they worked, Williams spoke about each victim, sharing what he remembered of their lives before Thompson's experiments destroyed them. "Johnny Crow Feather wanted to be a teacher," Williams said, placing stones on the young man's grave. "He used to come to church sometimes, asking questions about how to reconcile traditional Apache beliefs with Christianity. I told him they were incompatible, that he had to choose between his ancestors' wisdom and God's truth." Williams' voice broke. "I never understood that his ancestors' wisdom was God's truth." By the third day, they had eliminated every trace of Thompson's operation except for one final task. The mayor's correspondence with government officials made it clear that Washington was expecting regular shipments of essence, and when those shipments stopped coming, investigators would be sent to discover why. "We need a story," Apache said, reading through the letters. "Something that explains why Thompson and his operation disappeared without raising suspicions about what he was really doing." Williams had been thinking about the same problem. A fire. The church, the mayor's office, Thompson's house, everything burns in a single night. Faulty heating systems during the worst winter on record. Tragic accident that claims the lives of the town's leadership and destroys their records. It was a plan that would work, but it came with a price neither man had fully considered. Destroying the buildings would eliminate the evidence, but it would also destroy Whiteridge itself. The church was the heart of the community, the mayor's office was the center of government, and Thompson's house contained records that went back to the town's founding. "The people who survive will have nothing," Apache pointed out. "No leadership, no records, no community center. Some of them will die in the chaos that follows." Williams looked older than his 63 years as he contemplated the collateral damage their plan would cause. "The alternative is worse. If Washington discovers what Thompson was really doing, they'll send an army to capture or kill every creature in Alaska. How many innocent lives is it worth sacrificing to prevent genocide?" They set the fires on the fourth night after the liberation, using carefully placed accelerants to ensure the blazes would spread quickly and burn hot enough to destroy everything. Apache watched from his cabin as the glow lit up the sky over Whiteridge, knowing that he was witnessing the death of the only community he had ever known. The official story would be simple and believable. A series of tragic accidents during the worst blizzard in memory had claimed the lives of Mayor Thompson, Pastor Williams, and several prominent citizens, while also destroying most of the town's important buildings. Apache had been trapped in his cabin by the storm and knew nothing about what had happened until he arrived in town to find smoldering ruins. But Pastor Williams' final sacrifice went far beyond Apache's expectation. As the flames consumed the church, Williams walked into the building, carrying with him the last memory stone from Thompson's collection. Apache tried to stop him, but the pastor was determined to ensure that no evidence of the creature's existence would survive. "I've spent 33 years serving evil while calling it good," Williams said, his face illuminated by the growing flames. "Let me spend my last moments serving good, even if no one will ever know." Apache watched helplessly as the church collapsed with Williams inside, taking with it the final proof that the creatures had ever existed. The pastor's death would be recorded as a tragic accident, a faithful minister who died trying to save sacred items from his burning church. In the aftermath, Apache became the unofficial leader of what remained of Whiteridge, helping the survivors rebuild their community on foundations that had nothing to do with Thompson's corrupt legacy. He never spoke of what had really happened, and gradually the town developed new myths to explain the mysterious events of that terrible winter. Years passed, and Apache grew old, watching over a community that had forgotten its darkest secrets. He never married, never had children, never shared the truth of his heritage with anyone. The memory stones he had hidden in his cabin remained his only connection to the creature's world, glowing softly in the darkness and reminding him that somewhere in the deep mountains, love had found a way to survive. On winter nights when the wind howled through the peaks, Apache sometimes thought he could hear voices calling from the wilderness, not cries of pain or fear, but songs of joy and freedom. He never saw the creatures again, but he carried their memory in his heart until the day he died, knowing that his choice to save them had cost him everything and given him the only thing that truly mattered. The last entry in Apache's private journal, discovered after his death in 1891, read simply, "Today I heard cubs playing in the snow beyond the ridge. Some prices are worth paying." But Apache's story might have ended there if not for one final revelation that would transform everything the people of Whiteridge thought they knew about their beloved protector. Because when the townspeople came to settle Apache's affairs, they found hidden in his cabin walls dozens of memory stones that still glowed with warm light, each one containing the recorded experiences of an entire civilization. Young Sarah Thompson, the mayor's orphaned granddaughter, who had grown up believing her grandfather died a hero, was the first to touch one of the stones. The visions that flooded her mind revealed the truth about her family's legacy, about Apache's sacrifice, and about the choice between love and profit that had shaped their community's history. Sarah's tears as she experienced the creature's memories were witnessed by half the town, and within hours everyone in Whiteridge understood what Apache had done for them. He hadn't just saved a family of innocent creatures from genocide, he had saved an entire community from becoming willing participants in evil. The people of Whiteridge made a collective decision that night that would honor both Apache's sacrifice and the creature's continued survival. They would keep the secret, protect the memory stones, and ensure that future generations understood the true meaning of Apache's legacy, without ever endangering the creatures he had died to protect. And deep in the mountains where no human foot had ever walked, a young creature who had been born free because of Apache's choice grew to maturity, telling stories of the human who had taught his people that not all of mankind had forgotten how to love. In the creature's oral tradition, Apache Winters became a legend not for his strength or his hunting skills, but for his willingness to lose everything in order to save those who had no one else to protect them. The cabin where it all began still stands today, though few remember why it's considered sacred ground. But on quiet winter nights when the snow falls heavy and the wind carries voices from the deep wilderness, some say you can still hear the echo of a mother's gratitude and a promise that love, once given freely, never truly dies.